First, though, I want to start with the Prop 22 shenanigans because we finally had some good news.
Yep.
Ed, remind us what Prop 22 is, why we should care, and then what the latest developments are.
So Prop 22 is a law. It's a ballot measure that essentially gives the people who wrote it, the companies that wrote it, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, Postmates, which is now part of Uber, carve out from California labor law so that they can keep misclassifying their drivers as independent contractors to keep labor costs down, to reduce the expense of healthcare, to avoid a minimum wage, and try to gin up a narrative to investors that there's a path towards profitability, even though they haven't found one yet. And so the ballot measure was passed in November after a pretty deceptive and expensive race. It was the most expensive ballot measure in California history.
$200 million spent?
Yeah. Uber alone spent 60, Lyft spent and another 50, I believe, and then DoorDash and Instacart and Postmates contributed the rest. There was astroturfing. There was political consulting groups that were hired to harass and smear activists. There was endless advertisements, endless, pro Prop 22 text messaging, in-app prompts to support or pledge to support Prop 22 for the drivers. This went on for months and months, and so it won 58 to 42.
Yeah, can I just say, my family was getting mailers that said Bernie supported it.
Yeah. There was.
It was.
There's what they did is they, basically sent out. They had firms that they hired that are really good at doing this specific thing, where they send out a vaguely named group that seems to be affiliated with a progressive or with a well-known national or statewide figure, and so you assume that that's who's supporting it, right? And it's not legal. I mean, it's not illegal somehow, so they get away with it, or they get like a very small fine if the regulatory body decides to. But it was because of that confusion that I think in like exit polls you see like 40% of people just thought that they were voting to give drivers like a livable wage, a higher minimum wage, instead of actually the opposite, which was voting to give them a much lower wage and a more captive relationship with the companies. So that got struck down and ruled as unconstitutional.
So SEI sued, challenging the constitutionality of this thing. And was the outcome surprising?
I think initially I thought that there wouldn't be a ruling on it, right? Because they've had the lawsuit. There was also the Attorney General, after Xavier Becerra became Secretary of Human Health and Services. That Attorney General filed a brief opposing the arguments put forth by SEIU and the three drivers that they brought on, saying that it is constitutional. But the argument of the complaint makes sense, I think, which is that there's a clause inside of the ballot measure that says unless you have a 7/8 majority, you cannot vote to modify any part of this bill or to approve collective bargaining efforts or to do new laws that contradict what we want. And even if you do get that majority, we have to approve it. And so the argument was that this is unconstitutional. This limits the ability of the legislature to make laws, and so it should be struck down.
So it was really this kind of procedural overreach built into the ballot measure that ultimately got it struck down. There was some language, though, that seemed like there was a kind of a substantive rejection of what was going on, right? That it kind of wrongly included a bar on unionizing, that it was trying to, seem very superficially, like facially designed to protect the interests of the gig business owners.
Yeah. The judge, the Alameda County judge for the Superior Court, said that it was something along the lines of this is very clearly something that benefits no one but
here it is. It appears only to protect the economic interest of the network companies and having a divided, ununionized workforce, which is not a stated goal of the legislation.
Right.
Okay, so they're planning to appeal this, so it's not all said and done. But in the interim, it's nice to have this little breath of fresh news. I want to play for you an interview that shows what the response from the business community has been like.
Oh, God.
Because holy smokes, this idea, you've all mentioned these this misleading advertising that was going on, all of these flyers saying that, oh, progressive groups, Bernie, what have you, are supporting this initiative. And that idea that the people have spoken, that misleading advertisement that led to this ballot initiative passing is true democracy, is like a real theme in this business guy's pitch.
It's a sticky wicket, isn't it? How do you end up solving this aside from years and years of litigation? And meanwhile, the issue of how drivers get paid and having enough drivers, that's been tricky for Uber too.
Yeah, I think the really important thing is for people to put this in the right frame of mind. And there's one big issue that I don't think is talked about enough, which is, that if you poll the drivers, they're not looking for any changes. They're really happy with the flexible work product. If you look at the voters of California, they stepped up and voted and made it very clear in a state that voted 2-1, in favor of Biden. They came down very strong, 60-40, that they didn't want this to happen.
Vic, can you pause it? And I want you to respond just to that point, the idea that, this is what the drivers wanted and this is what the people of California wanted.
I mean, go
ahead, Josh, if you have thoughts.
Oh, no, it's this insane system. I remember when I first got to California and started finding out about it. And it's like, look, I'm not a believer in the infallibility of our elected officials, but we elect them for a reason. And one of those reasons is so that we as voters aren't going to have to plow through 15, 20, 30 pages of complicated legislation to figure out whether or not it's good for the state. And California has this insane system, and I know there's a few other states that do, where they do leave that to us. And then there's this incentive where, there's always these dueling propositions where you have you'll have one that's actually good for the environment. And then you'll have another one called the good for trees proposition, which is actually terrible for the environment, but they'll spend more money and they'll confuse you. And like you're saying, you'll get a mailer saying, hey, the Bad Faith podcast has endorsed this. And you're like, oh, I love Bad Faith, and it's complete gibberish. And as awful and as corrupt as your elected officials are, they are at least in possession of staff and attorneys and so forth who can read these things and vet them properly, so at least they know what terrible laws they're voting for. But it's like, gig workers did vote for this, some, because they didn't know what the fuck they were voting for.
Well, to that point, Ed, you mentioned in-app prompts to vote one way or the other.
Yeah, they had in-app prompts to be like, well, the California legislators starting their right to drive with us, and if you end up having this bill or this ballot measure turned down, right, or if you had AB 5 pass and codified as law, then you would likely not have trips, or you would have your flexibility threatened, and so on and so forth. And I mean, that's the point that he makes there. He talks about flexibility, but he talks about flexibility, he talks about how the drivers actually want this, but I mean, we've known for years now, and I think there's this really great study by Vina Dubois, who's a law professor at UC Irving, or UC Hastings, and she does a survey, and she's been doing surveys of drivers for years, and at that point it was 3 years of ethnographies, and she was talking about how the reason why a lot of drivers have ambivalence about becoming employees is because they recognize that on the one hand, you have a lot of security that would come out of it, and they want those benefits. They want healthcare, they want a minimum wage, they want that protection. But at the same time, they're already treated pretty poorly by these companies, right? So if the company can treat them this way and they're not employed by them, the fear is that they would treat them even worse and subject them to even worse limits if they were then employed by the company. And so there emerges a sort of ambivalence that she charts out, where it's a driver may want desperately to have some sort of security, and they'll maybe support piecemeal efforts to increase protections in one way or another. But until the core working conditions are fixed, they're not going to be enthusiastic about about becoming an employee, because they're already treated like shit. I mean, 96% of the drivers leave every year, right? They make below the minimum wage. And the ones who stay are trapped in because they have to pay for the car, either because they're leasing it or because of the vehicle miles that they're putting up on it. They have fuel costs. So you don't really have flexibility. You have a below minimum wage So you have to drive all the time. That's the flexibility you talk about.
And let's emphasize a point that Edward made earlier, which is these companies are not profitable. They have never shown a way to transport a passenger from point A to point B without losing money. They are supposedly coming up with this revolutionary way to do things, but the taxi, they have not made any advancements on the taxi except for an app. And it is driving taxis out of business and taking advantage of people. That's it. That's all they're doing.
Yeah, I think, Ed, at the end of your piece from yesterday, you pointed to the fact that the Uber's always in the red. What is it? Profit margins of negative 38 and 49%. And these numbers are, funnily enough, some of their best ever despite the pandemic.
Yeah, they've been working to bring down that number since they began. And how long have they been around? They have lost billions, and I am astounded when I go and look at how much money they lose every year and how much money they've lost since they began. They should not be in business. They are a failed business being propped up by rich assholes.
Well, so to that point, the guy we're listening to is an early Uber investor, which should surprise nobody.
Yeah.
Let's listen to just another minute or two of what he had to say, because it's just grade A BS.
And there's one entity that's really been pushing this the whole time, going all the way back to 85, and that's the SEIU. It is a single union, but to call them a single union understates it because they are the granddaddy of special interest groups. I sent along some data, maybe you can put on the screen. They spend more money lobbying than any other organization in our country and have for many, many years. They only represent 2 million members, but oddly, those members are in hospitality, healthcare, and government services. They're not even in this industry. So they're taking the dues from their members and using it to fight these battles because they want to expand their footprint. What they're really after is putting $420, which is the minimum member union fee for the 2 million they have. They want to expand that to these drivers. So they don't actually want to help them. They want to add to their cost. But they're the one that's been pushing this the whole time.
So any thoughts about big union and their evil lobbying efforts?
I'm a former member of that union, as I was a server for a while at Staples Center, and go fuck yourself. That's what I say to that guy. Yeah, guess what? Unions get to throw their money around to help the working class. That's their fucking job.
Yes, the biggest lobbying group in the country. When this is the most expensive, how many interest groups contributed to the $200 million that have been spent to promote this initiative?
Uber alone outspent the contribution of the SEIU. Right, this is a company that has burned $30 billion almost in the past 6 years, right? Never making a profit, has burned hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince drivers to come back to work for it, to convince regulators to support it. I mean, this is any one of the projects that Uber has done over the past few years far outstrip what labor would hope to do, you know? And it's funny that when labor is trying to advance like a certain outcome that's in their interest, and that's a devious private interest. But when like Bill Gurley, who's been with Uber, since some of the earliest days before when they had a previous CEO, Travis Kalanick, was with them from, in the trenches from the beginning. When he and his firms and when other financiers are throwing billions of dollars into this company, it's different. They're helping out the drivers, right?
Look, Ed, it hits different. Yeah, go ahead.
Not to push my own work, but we did a dollop on Uber, and it's not just the economics of it. The criminality, the spying on reporters, the creating software within their apps, however they do it, to not pick up regulators, to avoid picking up, the stuff they have done is completely insane and criminal. And on top of that, they're going to have such a hard time finding workers as everything goes forward, because all those people that stop working for them, they're not going to work for them anymore. And every single day that goes by, they have a harder and harder time finding laborers because there's not that many laborers out there. They just don't keep making them all the time.
Yeah.
It's a problem. And so they they're coming. It seems to me that this is all coming to a head for them. That's just the way as someone observing it and having had to use an Uber recently, which I didn't want to, but finding an Uber, incredibly difficult at this point, at least where I am.
Well, I remember, not to name drop, but I'm friends with one of the guys who runs the Dollop, and he sent me the Uber episode in advance. It was a big deep dive, and he's just like, just let me know if you think there's anything in here that's going to, get me in legal trouble. And it's an amazing episode, highly recommended. But I remember he gets to the end, and I think, didn't you say, Dave, they're literally the worst business in the world, or the history of the world, or something? I called him up and I go, everything seems fine, but can you say that? He goes, no, they actually are.
Right, it's not liable if it's true.
I think Elon Musk might have surpassed them in the last couple of years. Other than that,
maybe.
But it's I highly recommend it. I don't get a penny for saying that.
It's very interesting when you do a podcast like I do, when you actually go through and do all the research of what all the reporters have done over the years.
Yeah.
Because they're all going after one thing, the regulators, the this, that. And then when you put it all together in a big bunch, it's astounding.
Yeah, I strongly believe
that
podcasting is the backbone of the fourth estate, and people need to show due respect.
That's my side hustle also. Another
Ben
podcast.
Franklin said that first, I think.
Yeah. We have one.
I seem to recall there being something especially bad in the next little hunk of this clip, but if there's not, I won't belabor this clip too much.
Go for it.
Just listen to a little bit more, Ben.
Well, I think there's a bigger issue here because you talk about the SEIU and the gig economy issue here with Prop 22. It makes me think of the Teamsters taking on Amazon and warehouses as well. Now, that vote in Alabama, Bessemer, was defeated, but the fight continues. And, Jeff Bezos and now Andy Jassy and Amazon have set up that they need to be the best employer in the world for safety and for workers in general. Doesn't tech need to get ahead of these issues to innovate when it comes to labor just as much as they've innovated on the revenue and convenience line?
Yeah, well, the truth of the matter is I would say they already have. So if you poll drivers for any company, in food delivery or ride sharing, the thing that they love the most is the flexibility they have. They can go to work whenever they want. They can go to work whenever they want. Look, we are in an environment where there are massive job opportunities everywhere. Amazon's paying $3,000 signing bonus if you go to work there. McDonald's has a $300 bonus. There are 50,000
because they can't get anybody to come
Right
work.
now. I can get this right now.
These drivers were completely upset with their current situation. Why wouldn't they just go take one of those jobs? And I'll tell you why. Those are shift jobs. And those shift jobs mean you have to be there at a certain time and leave at a certain time. And driving for Uber or Lyft does not have that. This is the equivalent of the white collar. When we see all this Zoom and we talk about people who don't have to, hybrid work environments, they can live wherever they want. That's white collar flexibility. This is the same thing for entry level jobs. And it allows people to go through school, to pay down debt, to work as a stay-at-home parent.
We can cut it. Let's cut it before Josh has an aneurysm.
God damn it.
Oh my God, you too can shit in a yard. Do you want to piss in rose bushes because you don't have a break? Let's do this.
Oh my fucking God. How do you do that? How do you talk that way in front of me? Does that man think he's never going out in the world again? He's never going to run it? Jesus Christ.
He doesn't have to deal with them. That's it. He lives in a very different world.
Ever. He's part of the group of people on Nextdoor who just report delivery drivers because they're black coming to the door with a package. That's who he is.
This flexibility.
Jesus Christ.
Who amongst us hasn't gotten into a car like late at night or early in the morning and chatted with the driver about, are you at the beginning or end of your shift? Like, how long are you going? And they're like, well, I'm going at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Like, and they're not exactly thrilled about it. You know what I mean? Like,
the reason, it was relatively recently where they started to institute a mandatory shift, is in you can only drive a maximum of 12 hours and you have to get X amount of hours of rest because drivers are driving so much because they don't make enough money to not, right?
Right.
Even in New York City, they had a shift system. They had a quota system that they used to try to fire tens of thousands of drivers when the city increased the minimum wage that they all have to be paid, right? So this flexibility point is useful only to an end, and there's not even a safe company. I've written a bunch about the reports of Washington Post reporting that there's an internal investigative unit in Uber whose sole job is to shield them from liability when there's sexual harassment or assault. The markup has written about how when people get into carjackings, they try to pay them. They say, well, we'll compensate you, but only if you sign this NDA. They have like an elaborate system set up at multiple fronts to reduce liability, to push the costs onto you. And in that is the only way in which you can think of this flexibility. It's flexibility to like expose you to as many harms and costs as possible. That's it.
Yeah. And I saw you tweeting the question, why hasn't there been more Democratic Party pushback against this? And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the answer to that is, given especially this interesting relationship between, I don't want to take this too far, but, Tony West being, what is he, general counsel at Uber, and also Kamala Harris's brother-in-law, and that all just seems a little too incestuous for my liking.
Yeah, but that's also like, I think that's a model of how incestuous the relationships in California, specifically in the Valley and the Bay Area, can be when it comes to politics. These are, you have, for example, Newsom and Pelosi come from, large political families that go back generations and have dominated the city in one way or another, or are part of the groups that have dominated them, right? You have people like Harris who have, held political positions or had been, had donors or patrons or supporters that have, also been from some of these, families or rarefied families, but also it's just more so like the ideological, like, group that I guess they belong to, right? This is the ascendant wing of the Democratic Party. They dominate. They're the most visible people of the party. They did nothing, right, about a law that was about a ballot measure that would have bypassed labor law in their own backyard. And I think part of it is because they don't care. Part of it might have been because they thought that they really could. It would be enough to say some things at a national level, rhetorically, and then maybe hammer out a compromise in Congress or at the state level itself. Newsom tried to hammer out a compromise between unions and the gig companies that favored the gig companies, right? So I think like it is. When I asked that, I was hoping like a bit tongue in cheek, because I feel like from my reporting that I've seen, from the people that I've talked to, from the drivers and the organizers, and all the conversations and reporting I've been doing over the past few years, it just feels very much like if someone is not speaking out on it, it's because they don't see a fundamental problem with it, or they think of it as less of a problem than it really is. They don't see the threat to labor law. They don't see the pain that's being caused to these drivers. They don't see that they're having to sleep in their cars, go without food, go without health insurance, not see their families for years or for months at a time. They don't see that, and it doesn't register for them, and they don't seem to be curious enough to look for that. And that, I think, is an attitude that kind of permeates a lot of these representatives, these political figures, when it comes to, labor, when it comes to like some of the more pressing like frontiers of it.
Go ahead,
Edward, do you feel like maybe a part of this now is also that it's gone so far that if they do see the problem, they know they're culpable for what they've helped create?
Part of it, like, to solve this, there's a easy fix in the technical sense, right, which is reclassifying them. But then there's also the larger question of like the reason why the gig economy exists is because, one, there's like been an attempt to exploit all the underemployed people or the people who desperately need work, right, and will work and do demeaning and grueling work to make ends meet, right? And then there's also the fact that there's just a bunch of capitalists who want like huge returns and think that one way to do it is by making things that are legal through, regulation or through lobbying, right? And so I feel that a good, like, part of it, maybe some people do think it's gone too far, but that also there's a reluctance to admit that like this is going to require a big fix. This is going to require expansion of social programs, jobs programs, like a retooling of how people are going to work, or how we're going to manage some of the systems that are affected here, right? For transportation, for transit in general, if we're going to employ them. Because the companies will try to respond likely by scaring and trying to fire people, as they did in New York, right? Trying to fire tens of thousands of people. And that's going to have a huge backlash. I think that they're fearful of that outcome and fearful of that having a huge backlash on them.
I think your point about tech having this relationship with the Democratic Party is a really interesting one, because up until very recently, it has felt like technology companies are perceived as friendly and cozy and liberal and progressive in a way that other kinds of corporations haven't been. And I was frankly shocked to be listening to a recent episode of Pod Save America and hearing them drag Mark Zuckerberg, because I feel like 3 years ago, that would not have been or at least pre-Trump, and he started, taking on heat for the role that Facebook played in his election. I mean, the goal, I'll speak for myself coming from, the Ivy Tower, as it were. Everybody wanted to work for Facebook. Everybody loved Facebook. It was the idea, to go work in tech after college was perceived to be the golden hoop, where you could not seem like an exploiter and also be kind of operating at the top of your, achievement bracket, and suddenly I'm glad to hear that even, the PodSafe folks don't have that steady attitude anymore, but I don't know that translates so far to the actual Democratic Party actors.
Yeah, I mean, it's like finance. I mean, finance that way, it was like that in the 90s, but financiers went on to destroy the economy, and have they really faced any consequences for that? No.
Yeah, although it's a little less Tony. It sounds a little less sanguine when you go to work for Goldman Sachs.
And look, one of the biggest reasons that we don't have a massive debt after the pandemic in California is IPOs in Silicon Valley. We have created a massive problem. It's a monster.
Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.